Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, it is my great pleasure to welcome you back for the afternoon session of our symposium. I hope you guys are relaxed and ready for engaging debates. In this afternoon session, we are going to talk about a slightly different topic than we talked about during the morning, and that is US foreign policy. And I know that this symposium is mainly about Czech foreign policy, but we chose to include this panel for numerous reasons. And the main one is that we as Europeans tend to qualify and maybe even judge US foreign policy through the prism of transatlantic relations, as to how it affects the transatlantic relations. If US foreign policy affects transatlantic relations negatively, we tend to generalize and say that US foreign policy is not very good, right? But we need to bring more perspectives and not be trapped within this prism that we have. And we know that the US foreign policy of Donald Trump, of the Trump administration, has been accepted and perceived in Europe with very mixed results, I would say. We had a conference here that was already mentioned in the morning, a conference last week that focused on transatlantic relations. So we know very much this debate is going on, and we know quite well what other Europeans think. But we don't know that much what other countries who are in a similar position with the United States or other actors in terms of security partnerships like Japan or Australia, what they think about US foreign policy. Right? So this is the goal of what this panel should bring. And so let me now introduce our distinguished speakers who will facilitate these perspectives. And to my left, we have an American who will provide the context for this, for our discussion. And that is no other than Mary Thompson-Jones, who some of you probably know. She knows Prague very well because she served here at the embassy as the Deputy Chief of Mission and then as Chargé d'Affaires some 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So it'll be also very interesting to see your reflections on how the situation has sort of changed here also in the debates, right? And so Mary is currently in the academia. She's a professor. She's a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, and she has just recently published a very interesting book and very critically acclaimed book called "To the Secretary, Leaked Embassy Cables and America's Foreign Policy Disconnect." So I encourage you to read it. It's very interesting. Then to my closer left, we have representative from Australia, James Ferguson, who's the director of the Center for East-West Cultural and Economic Studies and assistant professor of international relations at Bond University. Among his recent publications are China's Eurasian Dilemmas, Roads and Risks for a Sustainable Global Power. Okay, so that's James Ferguson, who will be speaking from the, let's say, Australian perspective on US foreign policy. To my right-hand side, to the closer right-hand side, we have Michito Tsuruoka, he came to us from Japan, who's an associate professor at Keio University and also a research fellow at the Tokyo Foundation. He has published many works, including in the National Interest, the International Spectator, and just very recently I saw that you have written a paper on Japanese relations or Japanese perspectives on Donald Trump's foreign policy, so it's very timely. And so to my farthest left, we have Constantino Xavier, who came to us from India, who will be presenting the Indian perspective from the Indo-Pacific region, who is currently a fellow at Brookings, India. And prior to Brookings, he worked in other Indian think tanks, such as the Observer Research Foundation, and he also has a background in diplomacy. And as I read, you're just finishing your book on India's crisis response and involvement in neighboring countries. Okay, so without further ado, I would pass the word now to Mary, who will provide context for our discussion in terms of identifying some key trends in Donald Trump's foreign policy and how to make clear of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jan. I come here with a lot of humility. As a diplomat or a former diplomat, I don't take my welcome for granted these days in the Trump administration, so I appreciate in advance your willingness to listen. I do want to say that I speak here today on my own. I'm not here as a representative of the US administration, but I'm here based on my own foreign policy knowledge, my knowledge of the Czech Republic, may I say my affection for the Czech Republic and other European countries where I've lived and worked. So I appreciate that the theme of the conference is to be forward-looking. But in order to be forward-looking, I have to pay some obeisance to the past, to the recent past. And an anecdote occurs to me that's relevant, at least in my own mind. I had the pleasure of working on 3 different presidential visits here in Prague at various points in my career. 2 for President Barack Obama and 1 for President Bill Clinton. And as part of the preparations for Clinton's visit, I took the White House advance team over to the castle to meet with then President Václav Havel. He welcomed the team and ushered them into his office and took them over to his window. He said, "I want to show you something." So he looked out across his window and over to Tržiště Street, where, among many other embassies, some of which are larger, such as the German embassy, there is the US embassy. And he pointed up the hill to a small structure called the Glorieta, on which there is an American flag. And he said, "Just think of this. My predecessors had to sit here, and every day they had to look at that American flag, and there was nothing they could do about it." And he gave his sort of whimsical, characteristic grin, and he said, "And now I am here, and I look at that flag, and I think it's quite okay." So I think about that because the flag is an obvious symbol, and Clinton at the time had just given his inaugural address, and he talked about America as the world's indispensable nation. That's an idea that Obama carried forward. He used it in addresses as well. And in April of 2009, he came to the Czech Republic, and just down the hill from here at Hradčanské náměstí, he gave a speech on nuclear non-proliferation, again meant to demonstrate that America, in his mind as well, was the world's indispensable nation. Fast forward another almost 10 years, and we find ourselves with America that has become tired, some would say exhausted, with being the world's indispensable nation. We fought wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're still there. There are dangers that continue in the Middle East, intractable, unresolvable problems, new dangers from Russia, from China. Cyber warfare has possibly replaced nuclear warfare as the next danger on the horizon. And we've come a long way from the heady days of 1989, when the fall of the Berlin Wall seemed to indicate that everything was possible, and from the heady days following the election of America's first black president. Again, we thought everything was possible. We've since, in the aftermath, watched the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, other things that are inside American domestic society that suggest that maybe all is not well within our own country. 10 years ago, we also faced a global economic crisis. The Czechs actually weathered that crisis much better than many people did in my own country. Many families lost their homes, their jobs, their pensions, their retirement, and many of the kids who came of age in that era are going to be the first generation who are less well off than their parents were. So, understanding Donald Trump's presidency in this context and particularly his foreign policy, is crucial to understanding where America and perhaps where Europe might be headed. And I would suggest, again with much humility, that our fates, America's and Europe's, are still as strongly linked as ever, because Trump and his supporters in the United States are not alone. We live in an era in which Western Europeans are seeing across the board at least 20% of a voting population that prefers right-wing policies, be they anti-immigrant, nativist, or anti-globalization platforms. These voters in countries neighboring here, Hungary, Poland, France, Italy, Czech Republic, Sweden, a couple of weekends ago, just like their counterparts in America, are angry that the long-touted benefits of democracy and free market economies haven't trickled down to them. So in America, 2 years almost have passed since Trump's victory. And it's important to say that he was not elected on a foreign policy platform. And that's not unusual. In America, it's very rare that a presidential election would be decided on foreign policy issues. Nonetheless, the foreign policy aspects of his presidency are coming to be the defining aspect of this. So what do we make so far of the Trump administration? So I'd like to highlight just a few areas that we can expand on during the question period that strike me as hallmarks of the administration. The first is that he is the first president in a long time to have a darker vision of the world. Be they Republicans like Ronald Reagan, who was the happy optimist, the happy warrior, or Democrats like Clinton or Obama. Mostly Americans are optimistic, sometimes unrealistically optimistic about the future. This is not so with Trump. He frequently speaks of a dark, dangerous world in which America must push itself forward. His national security strategy, a document that's meant to be a defining roadmap for the country's security and defense policy, mentions the word competition more than 75 times, either the word competition or its derivatives, competing, competitive, etc. That seems to be noteworthy to me. We've also gone from an era in which America very confidently wielded liberal internationalism as part of an order that we ourselves created in the post-World War II era, to an era in which for the first time we've got a president who prefers bilateral negotiations, bilateral relationships. I think a lot of us consider that an experiment, maybe an interesting experiment. We'll see where it goes. I think for a lot of us, the time for that sort of relationship has come and gone, and the realities of a global liberal international order are deep enough that trying to carve off individual bilateral relationships will be at best marginally successful, but we will see. It's also a policy in which military spending is increased, energy spending is increasing, and it's the first time in which a president has directly linked economic prosperity to national security. And he uses that as a means to negotiate trade agreements as well as other international agreements. As you all know, we don't have a parliamentary system like you do in Western, Central Europe. We have a presidential system. And one of the keys to understanding Trump, it seems to me, is understanding the division of power. We're going to see that play out in the next few months when America has midterm elections. There's a lot of commentary right now that the United States as a whole ought not to be judged just by our administrative branch, but also by our legislative branch. We will see how independent Congress, both the upper house, our Senate, and the lower house, House of Representatives, ends up being with the pressure of trying to follow an administration, but also trying to support the Republican Party. One of the revelations from recent op-eds, one written by an anonymous senior administration official, and also the recent book that was just published by Bob Woodward, is that Trump, even within his administration, is often at odds with the people that he appointed and picked to lead various aspects of US foreign policy. There are a lot of examples of that. Trump will say something, or predictably he will tweet something, but it's important not only to watch what Trump says, but watch what his administration actually does. And in many ways, it follows a fairly traditional and maybe reassuringly predictable Republican orientation toward global policy. On the personality level, we've all had presidents, prime ministers that we've liked on a personal level, the kind of people who seem decent, honest, sort of guy that you could go out to a pub and have a beer with. Trump is not that guy for most Americans. Maybe some of the other leaders who are currently contending for power in your countries are not those kinds of people either. That doesn't mean that all Americans share that view. It doesn't mean that that's how we're going to go forward. I was greatly reassured by your deputy foreign minister who had a message of stay the course. And I would echo that message. And if I could be so presumptuous as to offer advice to my Czech friends and colleagues, I would say Euroscepticism is something that I know well from before the immigration crisis. I remember the Lisbon Treaty, and I remember the tension over when then President Klaus might agree to sign it, and the objections, the legalistic objections, the moral objections, the length of time that it dragged on. And at the end, he was forced to do what everyone conceded was best for the Czech people, for the Czech nation. So my advice is don't give up on institutions. The European Union is important. I was heartened by the discussion this morning about the intricacies of the European Parliament and how Czechs and others might advance their own legislative agendas and national agendas within the context of the European Union. And as a devoted transatlanticist, I would also say that NATO is important. Please don't be distracted by the 2% rhetoric that you're hearing. There is much, much more to NATO than the 2%. Czech Republic has made sacrifices of the greatest order in order to be a loyal ally in places far afield in Afghanistan and Iraq. The United States appreciates those sacrifices. Czechs are not alone. Others too have done that. To end, let me circle back to the beginning, to a Czech who influenced my thinking a lot, Václav Havel, and a slogan about the truth that I think resonates for a lot of us back in the States today. And now you'll get to hear me mangle Czech. But what Havel said was, Pravda a láska převažují nad lžem a nenávistí, which I think means, may truth and love have victory over lies and hatred. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for your insights. And thank you for reminding us that US foreign policy is not just Donald Trump, but it's also other branches of the government, especially the Congress, which in reaction to Donald Trump's rhetoric and discourse has released some and supported, strongly supported resolutions in support of the transatlantic partnership, NATO, etc. Right? Okay, now we move on to the perspective from Japan with Michito.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Mr. Tsuruoka from Tokyo. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here today and tomorrow. This is my second visit to Prague, and I always am quite happy to come back here. The Japanese perceptions about on the Trump administration and Trump foreign policy, I wouldn't say there is a consensus in Japan on what it means to Japan. But still, the general assessment still can be described as so far so good, but increasingly concerned. We are becoming more concerned about the future direction of the Trump administration's foreign policy. On the security front, it looks that things still look quite good. So some people still argue that the situation is better than previously, better than the period under the Obama administration. Because in the foreign security policy community in Japan, people didn't quite trust Obama's rhetoric of pivot to Asia or rebalance to Asia. So sustainability and credibility of US pivot to Asia was very much questioned under Trump. So in terms of deterring China or in terms of deterring North Korea, it looks that the Trump has been more successful than Obama. So on the security front, yes, there are still many people, perhaps including myself, still cautiously optimistic about the direction of the health of the US-Japan alliance. But when it comes to trade and economy, there are huge challenges and concerns. And looking at the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs on various countries, including Japan, and the escalating the trade tensions between the US and China, and those things have caused concerns a lot. And there's no possibility, as far as we see, that these tensions are going to disappear. There is no prospect for that. That causes a lot of concerns. And looking back the November 2016 election, the election result was quite shocking for Japanese as well, for many people as well. It was shocking, and because we didn't quite expect Trump to win. But very fortunately for Japan, the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the current Prime Minister, who's been in power for more than 5 years, and by Japanese standard, it's quite long administration, Prime Minister. And Mr. Abe was quite quick to adjust to the reality that Trump would become the next president of the United States, and he was quite quick to see the president-elect Trump. So just a few weeks after the election, Abe visited Trump Tower and met President-elect Mr. Trump. It was quite an extraordinary move for a sitting Japanese Prime Minister to see President-elect rather than meeting the incumbent President, Mr. Obama. And, but Abe was quite determined to establish a very good personal relationship with Mr. Trump. And for Japan, actually, whoever sits in the White House, the US president is the US president, and the United States is the only treaty ally for Japan. So it doesn't matter whether Mr. Abe loves or likes Mr. Trump or not. The US president is the US president, and we need to deal with him. And, the Abe actually was not quite successful in developing good personal relationship with Mr. Obama. So the Abe was determined not to repeat that failure. So the Abe is a strong believer in personal relationships at the summit level, and that was why the Abe visited not just Trump Tower before inauguration, but for the first time as a US President and Japanese Prime Minister in February last year, the Abe went to the Florida and the Mr. Trump's golf course as well, and then they played golf together. And over the past 1.5 years, the two leaders played golf together already 3 times, and that's quite an achievement. And we call it Gulf diplomacy. Whether it really works or not, it's something that we don't know. But for us, as an US ally, it's always good to see a good personal relationship between the Japanese Prime Minister and the US President. So this personal aspect of the US-Japan alliance has been quite important, particularly given the way of doing business of the Trump administration. But more structural reasons why Japan has been sticking to the US-Japan alliance is that first it has to do with the fact that Japan doesn't actually have Plan B. So the level of security dependence on the United States is quite high, and it's becoming higher in recent years. So I think there is a bit of gap between the level of European dependence on the US for its security and the Japanese level of dependence on security on the United States. So because of that, and Japan doesn't have a Plan B, so particularly in the light of what's been taking place in the Asia-Pacific region, the North Korea, it looks that now, over the past several months, it looks that the situations are getting better. And just yesterday and day before yesterday, we saw hugely happy pictures from Pyongyang, the North-South Summit. But looking at the capability of North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, nothing has changed. So despite all the rhetoric of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, in terms of capability, nothing has changed. So seen from Japan, sitting just next to the Korean Peninsula, we have to also, of course, look at the capabilities rather than just political and diplomatic rhetoric. So we still very much face ballistic missile and nuclear weapons threats from North Korea. So we have to deal with that. But it's just impossible for Japan to deal with all such threats alone. So the US-Japan alliance is needed. But of course, we are not only talking about North Korea. The bigger long-term challenge and concern, a source of concern, of course, is China. So China is much bigger than North Korea. So we have to deal with China, the rise of China, and the increasing assertiveness of Chinese, particularly in the maritime domains, not just in South China Sea, but also in the East China Sea. So because of those the security situations, we need the United States, and so that is why we don't have a Plan B, very unfortunately. And also looking at the domestic political situation in Japan, what is quite fortunate for Japan is that we are not quite seeing a rise of populist political forces or extreme right type of populist political forces. We are not quite facing that, which is quite good for the current government. So we don't really have to worry about the spillover of what might be called Trump phenomenon to our domestic politics. So that is another reason why Japan and Tokyo has been sort of relaxed about the Trump administration over the past 1.5 years. And let me turn to what Japan is doing in terms of maintaining and strengthening the alliance with the United States. And on the security and defense field sides, the strengthening the alliance is one of the things that we are doing is to enhance the military-to-military cooperation between Japan and the United States. So Japanese self-defense forces and the US military, we have been doing more and more joint exercises, including those at very high-end things like counter A2AD, the anti-access area denial thing, and the anti-submarine warfare type of exercises, and we have been doing, and amphibious exercises as well. So we are doing more and more joint exercises, and also in terms of the intelligence and surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR activities in the Western Pacific region as well, and the Japanese forces and US forces are doing more together. So the very close military-to-military relationship hasn't been affected by political climate, and so that is going quite well. And also the implicit part of this package or deal is that Japan is likely to buy more US equipment, defense equipment, from the United States, and Mr. Trump is very much focusing on that. So there are some critics in Japan say that the fact that Japan is going to buy more US equipment is a means to please Mr. Trump. So perhaps that might be somewhat true, but the buying US equipment is actually very necessary in terms of addressing threats from North Korea and addressing challenges from China. So we are going to introduce what is called the Aegis Ashore. That's a ballistic missile defense system onshore. So that Japan has the fleet of Aegis vessels capable of doing the ballistic missile defense function. But in addition to that, we are going to introduce Aegis Ashore, the ballistic missile defense system, and we are going to buy a number of F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter, and those are very expensive fighters, but we really need because of in the light of the rapid improvement and development of similar fighters in China and Russia. But on trade front, what Tokyo has been trying to do is a sort of hedging. So just 2 months ago, before summer break, Japan and Brussels signed a FTA, what is called the Economic Partnership Agreement between the EU, European Union, and Japan, together with the SPA, the Strategic Partnership Agreement, which is a framework political agreement accompanying the EPA. So this EPA and SPA, the new institutional framework between the European Union and Japan, that is quite timely, because now there are growing concerns about the future of a multilateral free trade system. So now that the EU and Japan signed EPA, that gave a strong symbolic strategic political message that that free trade is still alive. So that was a quite important strategic move from the Japanese side, and also in the Asia-Pacific region, the US, the Trump administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, but after that, following that, Japan played a major role, a leading role in sort of reviving the TPP. So TPP 11, meaning that the TPP without the United States was signed. So it's officially called CPTPP. It's a bit quite complicated, but a comprehensive and progressive agreement for TPP is called CPTPP. It's essentially TPP 11, meaning TPP minus the United States. But this is also a very strategic move, because we wanted to maintain the momentum for free trade in the Asia-Pacific region, because TPP, there's no secret that TPP was somewhat about China, because the United States, Japan, and the other countries, including, of course, Australia and other like-minded countries, wanted to remain in the driving seat in terms of rule-making in the international trade area. So it is about rule-making. So it's quite sad that the United States withdrew from that, but Japan's position is that we always welcome the United States coming back. So it's quite important that not to give up the US leadership and the US commitment to the rule-based liberal international order. So in the absence of the United States for some time, it is for our responsibility, Japan, European countries, and Australia and other like-minded countries, to maintain this functioning rules-based international order, and then expecting the United States to come back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michito. You mentioned that Japan has no plan B for its own security if the US withdraws, but maybe Donald Trump has already suggested a plan B for you, if I'm not mistaken, during his campaign, where he said that Japan and South Korea should acquire nuclear weapons. So maybe if we have time during this discussion, I'd like to hear your take on this. So now we move to another security partner of the United States, and that is Australia.
Thank you very much, Chairperson Hornát. Thank you to the conference organisers and to, of course, our colleagues and audience today. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here in Prague. It is my first time. So I will turn now very quickly to the main issues as I see them in relation to the impact of US policies on the Indo-Pacific generally, recapping perhaps what we all know, but moving fairly quickly on to Australia's policies. So on this basis, we can see really a very huge galvanisation of reactions to Trump's initiatives, even before election, of course, leading to really a whole series of resets, shake and bake kind of policies in order to force renegotiations, but allowing other agreements to roll forward. And we all know this withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, renegotiating NAFTA through quite strong negotiations with Mexico, still to be conducted perhaps with Canada, efforts to break through and reset relationships with both Iran and North Korea. When we turn to the effort to renegotiate in some ways the relationship between the US and China, initially worked along several lines. One was to draw in China to help change conditions on the Korean Peninsula and gain support to at least reduce, if not eliminate, nuclear weapons and missile programs in North Korea. Not, of course, successful at this stage, and in fact not really possible given current conditions. Likewise, the effort of running a 100-day action plan, trying to reset trade tensions, as we see that's failed, leading to the current so-called trade war. But the bigger set of policies really behind this may be some effort to reduce or at least shape PRC's relative gains in comprehensive national strength, as termed in Chinese policy, in the Indo-Pacific, to really slow down that relative advantage and set of gains to try and create room for accommodation with the US and its interests. Now, of course, there's in theory a whole series of dialogues annually that should deal with these tensions between China and the US, diplomatic and security dialogue, comprehensive economic dialogue, law enforcement and cybersecurity dialogue, social and cultural issues, and they work on many small issues, but really failed to reset the bigger relational dynamic between the two most powerful players in the Indo-Pacific. Now, this is most obviously seen in Trump's America First policies and the expanding pattern of tariffs bilaterally, now worth around $200 billion in terms of Chinese exports, around $55 billion roughly from the basically US imports, basically US exports into China. But what is more interesting is the reasons given for these events. Obviously, they're about trade, reducing the US trade deficit, putting pressure on China in relation to theft of US intellectual property and so on. But other reasons have been suggested. One has been some idea of slowing down PRC's move to becoming a high-tech global power with independent scientific, R&D and security capacities that would close the strategic gap of power very quickly between China and the US. And that's all found really in the Made in China 2025 initiative and the recent 5-year plans targeting areas like R&D, computing, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. And this is not theoretical. This is happening directly now as we speak. And when the strategic gap closes is the period of greatest tension between great powers, clearly understood in PRC and PLA, army planning. Of course, if you want a more simple analysis, perhaps this is part of a transactional bargaining tactic, giving Trump freedom to move, to perhaps force China to accommodate a little bit more to preferred US foreign policies and leadership in the Indo-Pacific. In any case, there have already been quite strong impacts on China, There are major concerns that this could expand. In theory, up to $517 billion worth of goods could be affected if it continues. In China itself, there's been some drop-off in the Shanghai Composite Index of stock markets, and also some drop in the value of renminbi, perhaps due directly to the impact of these policies. And some estimates suggest an initial loss in the order of $22 billion for major companies exporting out of China. Of course, there could be long-term impacts on the US itself as well. Reducing the bilateral deficit with China is unlikely to reduce overall deficits or trade imbalance. And of course, we can see that basically there's a huge influx of investment still into the United States. China is likely to reassert and try to comprehensively modernize itself and its own economy, but with less involvement and cooperation with US companies. And that could close opportunities if this moves into an entrenched position on both sides. Likewise, the flow-on of increased costs to imports of Chinese goods into the US, impact upon different commodity and production chains, in theory could cause some inflation and also, of course, affect in the long run levels of unemployment. Now, I'm not suggesting that this will continue indefinitely, and the US does have more independence in some areas, particularly in energy areas. There's access to, of course, fracking technologies and shale oil. And basically, what we might see is just a shift, really, in terms of the relative reliance of countries in the region on the US dollar, on US supply chain, and also US leadership in international trade and currency regimes. Now, this has already occurred, of course, in relation to China and Russia, but the issue is to what degree Australia and perhaps even countries like Japan may have to hedge their bets if this competition continues. So this is perhaps a fairly high risk game in which certain other arrangements may be once again looked at more forcefully. So certainly the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, as was mentioned, is one of these, but also there's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership driven by ASEAN and its key dialogue partners, a more Chinese-led initiative, more slow in its impact, but perhaps giving less developed economies some better access into trade flows, and of course the more dynamic and overlapping BRI, Belt and Road, and Eurasian Economic Union policies now being negotiated by Russia and China. So there are other multilateral frameworks where some countries can perhaps hedge some of their bets. So even though the alliance with Japan, for example, has definitely been deepened, it's a little bit unclear to what degree the Trump administration can support Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific agenda, looking at the two-ocean policies, dealing with non-traditional security issues, sustained development across Asia and Africa. This is a very comprehensive Japanese-led policy that really is a very positive step enhancing what is usually viewed as soft power. Overall, so far, the Trump policies have polarized some of the politics of the Indo-Pacific, and of course, particularly in Australia. Australia has a major surplus with China, which is, of course, Australia's major trading partner. That's been sustained as a trade surplus of over $37 billion over the last 2 years, each and every year. But Australia, of course, has a crucial alliance relationship with the US, in the past based on the ANZUS Treaty, but now a much wider pattern of dialogue called the OSMIN Dialogues. That's basically all major ministries, particularly Defence and Foreign Affairs, meeting regularly, giving Australia, as at best a middle power, a direct input into major discussions about the Indo-Pacific. In terms of that ANZUS Treaty, it does not require specific actions by either the US or Australia. It's more viewed as a form of insurance policy, now transformed into specific agreements about status of personnel, cooperation in high-tech areas, military exercises, all those more specific areas. But really it's about strategic culture, perceived shared interests, and a kind of safety guarantee for Australia, which it hopes will never be used. Likewise, the US is the major investment partner for Australia, well ahead of China or anybody else, followed by the UK, the EU as a whole, then Japan, and even if you factor in Hong Kong and China, they're well below those top-ranking areas for investment. So what we've kind of seen is a dilemma. Australia, in every single white paper, says there is no dilemma between trade and security, but everyone knows that there are cross impacts. And this is the image of Australia sitting on the fence and feeling very uncomfortable indeed. Essentially, Australia does give support to issues like freedom of navigation, at least verbally, definitely supports ASEAN generally in its effort for multilateral dialogue on the South China Seas, supportive of Japan generally in terms of the East China Sea, is critical of some aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative, and very cautious about Chinese influence in the South Pacific. But every government in the last 2 decades certainly is very cautious about how far they can antagonise their major trading partner and how far they can project power as a kind of automatic ally. That automatic alliance can no longer, I think, be assured, at least as far as the Australian public is concerned. I will not get anecdotal, but let's just say that the idea of the automatic phone call from the White House guaranteeing an outcome is not as it used to be. I think you'll know the agenda there. Indeed, Australia has turned to recommit to multilateral forums, being very active in hosting a special ASEAN, Southeast Asia, plus a summit in this year. It's of course sought to be very active as a middle power, engaging with South Korea and Indonesia. It has built the 2+2 dialogues with Japan, that is foreign affairs and defence, as a special bilateral dialogue with Japan and another dialogue, of course, with South Korea. So in other words, a low, perhaps a sort of southern agenda has shifted to engagement in Northeast Asian policies as well. Now, in fact, concerns about the stability of the long-term engagement of the US has even led to some consideration of Plan B. There is a Plan B in Australia, but it's rather limited. It basically requires an increase in defence spending towards 3%, getting nuclear-powered submarines, increasing defence relationships with Japan, Indonesia and India. But it's really only a degree of freedom. It's only a limited degree of shift in policy. And if you want a game plan how independent Australia could become, you start talking about 5% of GDP in defence, re-gearing intelligence networks across the world, rechanging and re-gearing access to entire segments of advanced weaponry. This would be, in fact, a nightmare for any government to achieve. So, a real alliance relationship, a real investment relationship, but limits to how far Australia can adopt a sort of comprehensive pro-US stance. One limit, for example, is in freedom of navigation exercises. Australia supports the principle of those navigation exercises, but will not do joint patrols to avoid the image of a new CETO, that is a Southeast Asian Treaty Organisation, a failed organisation which I won't go into, because that would directly alarm and create serious and direct impact on Chinese policies. Really, domestically, Trump's policies have deepened the domestic divides between conservative and left and right groups within Australia. Conservative groups are very happy to follow Trump to reduce engagement in climate change, Paris Accords, to of course become more restrictive in what it allows Chinese companies to do, particularly in the technology area, and actually pass very strong laws in terms of technological development and what can be shared with partners overseas. Now that's backfired already because in fact both US and European companies could come under those clauses as well, leading to concerns from Northrop Grumman and from Saab, which are involved in development in high-tech. There's a lot of very high-tech development in software, jamming, over-the-horizon radar, the advanced patterns of AWACS and wedge-tail Eagle aircraft. A lot of that's done through joint development at very high levels of security, where you have Australian researchers with high clearance at US levels of clearance. and often it's, they have higher clearance perhaps than any academic ever would. So here we see limits compounded by the pattern of revolving doors of prime ministers. I know there are lots of jokes about this, but one thing to realise is that in a parliamentary system, you don't want your foreign policy run by the leader of the state. It's basically run through cabinet foreign policy, a whole system of policies that remain on track. So this is not such a big dilemma for Australia, really. Likewise, Australia's continued its engagement with ASEAN, Southeast Asia, supported the new version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, continued dialogues with India, Indonesia, South Korea and Japan, but it really needs a peaceful Indo-Pacific order. And here occasionally Australia can be very progressive. Just recently a new agreement's been made, the Pacific Regional Security Declaration with South Pacific states, allowing for a comprehensive approach to maritime security, creating a kind of fusion centre for creating maritime awareness right across the South Pacific. That impinges on the West Pacific to a small degree and is seen very much as a model of shared cooperation for things like fisheries and managing resources, non-traditional security threats. And it's a case of welcome policy within the Pacific Forum as well. Likewise, it's very active in regional exercises, including Exercise Kakadu, Indo-Pacific Endeavour exercises, the Exercise Pacific Partnership, big focus on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. That is, military assets used in support of humanitarian and foreign policy objectives. So here Australia has been quite active and has continued those range of policies. So what we see is perhaps some shift to a bit of hedging, some other efforts to generate regional order. But the real outcome in terms of think tanks and policy groups is looking forward to the post-Trump era. Now this is a bit of a dilemma because you're essentially putting a lot of your policy on hold, waiting to see what happens next. Regardless of the outcome of the midterm elections, who runs for the Democrats and a whole range of other issues, let alone the 2020 elections, there won't be a return to status quo US leadership of the Indo-Pacific. It's going to be re-geared and changed. They may regain that leadership, but it's going to be through changing and adapting to the circumstances around them. But in the worst case scenario, one of the big fears is that we might see instead a China and US Indo-Pacific disorder, where competition is intensified to the point of strategic confrontation. And here I have to make a very brief statement about automatic alliances. We are aware, of course, the NATO alliance, but once NATO works out of area, it can become very controversial as to who will support those policies, as in Iraq in 2003. Likewise, if Australia was asked to engage in direct confrontation with its major trading partner, there would be serious questions asked as to why, and indeed a lot of focus of current thinking in Australia is how to make sure that never ever happens. So we must be very careful about assuming that all alliances are automatic, even if historically grounded. So the effort to bring some conditionality into that relationship is something Australia does, even while in popular face-to-face presidential PM leadership, there's very much all the way with the US. In fact, there's an effort to at least gain some ability for middle powers to have a bit more say, a bit more traction. So Australia doesn't want to be on a barbed wire fence. It wants to be part of the table of negotiators of any future Indo-Pacific re-gearing of power and relationships. The US has to be part of that, and so does China. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Okay, and since we're running a bit out of time, we move right on to our last perspective, and that is the perspective from India. And in fact, from my reading of the issues, it seems that there have been quite great expectations about partnership, a future potential stronger partnership between the United States and the Trump administration and India. And so has this materialized somehow? What are the prospects?
Thank you, Jan, for the introduction, and The questions, my apologies to the extreme right of the room. I hope you're not too annoyed, but there are screens there to follow me indirectly. Thanks for organizing this. Thanks for hosting me. And it's a very important debate. I think bringing in various actors beyond just Europe, the US, but several Asian actors in particular. And it's a dual homecoming from me to Prague, actually. It's the first time I'm in Prague. I reached yesterday evening. It's the first one because it's remembered that my great-grandmother is actually born very close to here in Slani. My mother just told me yesterday. So that's the first nice news that I feel very happy to be here. And the second one is, you know, I'm a European. I grew up in Europe, but I've spent now almost 20 years studying and researching on India, including living in India currently and working in India. But somehow India has plans to send me back here and keep focusing on Europe. So it's a homecoming in the sense that I'm working a bit more on India-Europe relations, and it's great to share after sort of 2 years of work on Europe-India some of my findings, and on the US in particular. And so I think it's important to speak about the US. I'll try to share how India looks at the US. But you'll see that I'll try to make it a bit broader in the sense that it's very difficult to understand India's engagement with the US without talking about Europe, without talking about Japan, without talking about Australia, and several other like-minded powers. You've heard this term before today. I think it's a key word today to signal a variety of regional powers. Middle powers is another term used, that are concerned about global developments, about the disruption the global order is going through, and in many ways are taking their fate in their own hands. So a note of optimism, I think, in my perspective, that several regional powers are stepping up, reaching out to each other, not relying on the United States or on China, which are clearly the two leading powers today in the system, to take initiative. So I'll just structure my talk in three quick segments. The first one, just to make the main point, which I just made in many ways, that this is a time for Europe and India to join hands and to continue what in many ways the US and the transatlantic community has built since the 1950s. And in many sense that's now, I think, the order of the day for these middle powers and like-minded powers. Again, Australia, Japan, India, Europe in particular. Second section, I'll just go a bit deeper into the US, into China, and into these other like-minded powers, and look at how India looks at these three different types of actors, the US, China, and the other like-minded powers. And then I'll just finish with sort of I think an appeal for Europe and India in particular to take a lead on several of these global governance issues. So, I mean, just looking back, I was reminded of a statement I came across by Prime Minister Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India. He was talking about Europe in 1936. So India was still fighting its freedom struggle against British colonialism. And he spoke in Lahore, current Pakistan, undivided India. And let me quote, he says in 1936, Asia and even India will play a determining part in the future of world policy. Europe has ceased to be the center of activity and interest, end quote. So this is 1936, and of course, as we've seen even in recent decades, this idea of a shift towards the East and Asia is very prominent. Everyone's speaking about Asia. This has roots back to Japan in the 1980s when Japan was supposed to be the next superpower. Now it's China and India. So I think that's an interesting sort of pessimistic note coming from the East on the role of Europe. But if you look at the last 5 to 10 years, you see exactly the opposite happening. Today's India is extremely keen in engaging Europe and the transatlantic community. It actually sees in many ways its own future being tied to Europe, to the history of European integration, to the history of multilateralism, to the experience and expertise of regulations and standards in governing technology and new disrupting factors we're seeing. So you actually have an increasing interest in India on what's happening in Europe. You see it recently. Prime Minister Modi has done a record number of visits to Europe. The President of India was here a few weeks ago, visiting the Czech Republic and other Central and Eastern European countries. But what's puzzling is that you have history, in many ways, connecting Europe and the larger transatlantic community to India. You have economics, you have democracy. Europe and India are the largest democratic polities in the world. But I think what's interesting is that the convergence of concerns has actually now activated a convergence of interests. So that's a negative agenda in many ways, that there's a certain concern about the US and the role of the US in the international order. There's a certain concern about the role of China in the current and possible future order. And that's bringing these powers together. And keep in mind, everything I'm saying about Europe and India can apply equally to Australia and India, Japan and India, and these other middle powers. So I think my main point here is that in many ways, the receding role of the US, in particular, the ascent of President Trump and the disruption he's brought and the uncertainties. And I was in DC literally last week, and it is a very sorry state of affairs. I mean, we've seen the stories about how he's undermined the bureaucracy, sidelined the bureaucracy, questioned some things for the good, but also disrupted a lot and threatened a lot in terms of the internal stability and the leading role of the US internationally. So, but paradoxically, that sort of Trumpian moment, if you want, in international politics has actually done a favor, because it's led these various countries to activate their plan Bs, and that's sort of plans B. And many of these countries have started saying we don't have to rely on the US to steward this international order, and we have to take our fate in our own hands, and we have to reach out. So while it's often seen as, a new alliance or something, I think that's not really the main incentive. The main incentive for these countries to come together is not the US, it's not China. It's actually very weak relations within each other. The India-Australia relation is extremely weak traditionally. The India-Japan relation only flourished in the last 5-6 years. The India-Europe relation is still far less developed than the EU-China relation and Europe-China relation. So that's the first story, and therefore thank you Trump and thank you US for activating all these alternative plans. The second thank you note for this development goes to China. I think the disrupting factor of China has led many of these countries to share a common concern. And I don't say a threat assessment, because that's a very big word, but a concern about the role of China within international institutions, within the global governance framework, and the capacity to respond to this, whether engaging China or containing China. And it's always going to be a game of carrots and sticks in that sense. So that's very interesting, and therefore I think a note of thanks to China, because it's really facilitated a lot of clogged relationships between these middle powers, between Europe and India. And that's a welcome development. So I think on now these, in my second segment, on these very sectoral engagements as seen from New Delhi. On the US, I think the India sees really a transformation from a US that used to be a leader to one of a facilitator and enabler. The US is, I think, less engaged, but that's not necessarily bad news. The reliance, the overt reliance, and taking the US for granted, I think that period is over, at least in India. And you're realizing that you now can rely on the US to play a more facilitating role, for example, in the India-Japan relationship, which was incentivized by the US under President Obama. But at the same time, it's one where you have to be more autonomous and work out different architectures, balances of power with other middle powers, rather relying on this sort of unipolar hegemon in the 1990s and 2000s. So that's an interesting relationship now. You had good years, bad years between India and the US, a decent 15 years between 2000 and 2015, when which President Bush, Obama, I think the relation flourished. It's a strong strategic partnership now between India and the US. And you have, of course, the whole language about the Indo-Pacific, integration, Indian Ocean region, maritime security. And that's, I think, all flourishing, and that's decent. And actually it goes to the stability of the relationship, that despite President Trump and his questioning of a lot of these partnerships, the relationship as a whole has proven to be quite strong. And I think that speaks to the importance of the bureaucratic element in this. If you look at the biggest advocates of India in Washington today, they're in the State Department, they're in the Defense Department, they're in the business sector, in the entrepreneurial sector, in civil society, which again brings me to the importance of the democratic element in how these countries work with each other. On China, I mean, the relationship has always been a difficult one. In the 1950s it was good. Then the 1960s war was fought between India and China. There's been normalization since the 1980s, and particularly on the economic front. China is consistently among top 3 trading partners of India. So while on the economics, the relationship are good, on the security, politics, the relationship is not so good. And I think now, while 10 years ago people still believed that China could somehow be co-opted, socialized into international institutions, the AIIB, for example, Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, was an example of that, where India joined hands with China to create an alternative investment bank. But soon realized that, you know, in particular with the Belt and Road Initiative, that there were certain areas, and I think a long-term understanding that you could not work with the Chinese. And that at least you would not be able to wait for the Chinese to move around, and uncertainty was growing. I think Chinese assertiveness also grew. And therefore, I think while 10 years ago people thought of, is China a competition, a threat, a friend, an ally? Today in Delhi, everyone agrees that China is a concern, it's a problem. Where people disagree is how to deal with this problem, China, or how to deal with this concern, China, if you want. And you see it in a variety of issues. Your Deputy Foreign Minister today mentioned that you're running for the United Nations Human Rights Council. There's a very interesting study coming out how China, rather than playing defense on human rights issues, has started to play offense in the United Nations. And that means ganging up a community of like-minded, different like-minded powers, including sometimes Saudi Arabia and several other countries, to penetrate these human rights institutions and use a language of conceptual terrorism in many ways, and shifting completely the meaning of human rights, liberalism, political rights, which makes it very difficult for other partners to even have a conversation about what we really mean when we speak about these issues. Similarly, on the Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, we heard about the debt traps and how investment leverage has been used for security purposes by the Chinese. This is something Europe and India share very closely in their respective peripheries, or in their respective internal developments. In South Asia, you have China playing a very important role in bringing a lot of development and growth to these countries, and that story must be told too. It's a very positive effect in many ways. But I think in the long term, the realization is that these are, it's an exercise in mock multilateralism. It's in effect a series of bilateral mechanisms in which China has developed to create an upper hand over several small countries, which again reinforces the importance of multilateralism and coordination among other countries while engaging China. So I think we should be no under illusion. I think particularly here in Central Europe, you are certainly under no illusion, because you have a history of understanding these developments, that there are no free lunches in politics and geopolitics. When China comes in with massive investments, they have interests, they can speak the language of win-win, but they will leverage, like any other great power in the past has, their economic influence and securitize that. And you start seeing this across Asia, including with political influence operations, penetrating the media sector, setting up their own think tanks, curtailing in many ways the free debate about anything, in many ways, not only geopolitics. So let me come to the third segment on middle powers, and just quickly go through. I mean, India looks at Japan now as a potential partner, and a very strong partner. Prime Minister Modi and Abe have met several times. They actually have an annual summit about to happen again next month. So the India-Japan relationship has flourished in this context. The India-Australia relationship has flourished in this context. 10 years ago, Australians and Indians would finger point at each other, accuse each other. You are just stooges of Western imperialists, what the Indians would say. The Australians would say, you Indians are non-aligned, hanging out with the socialists. That's over now. If you look at the India-Australia debates these days, they're extremely productive on maritime security, freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean region, in the Malacca Straits. So again, an unclogging of a relationship. On Europe, again, I've mentioned this before, the relationship with the EU has flourished. The summits are back on track. The relationship with France is very strong after President Macron visited India. There's now a logistics defense agreement, for example, between India and France, which was unthinkable 10 years ago. So again, the Europe-India relationship has flourished under that again. So let me finish with what this means, I think, for the future. You know, this morning we heard a lot of, if I may put it, strategic angst among the Czech participants, right? We don't have a strategy. We focus so narrowly on Brussels, on petty little domestic regional issues. We have to have a larger framework to think about things. This sounds very familiar for me. I mean, I grew up in Portugal. In Portugal, you had also an absence of 20 years of great strategic debates, because the focus was Brussels, integration. You forgot about Africa, Latin America, Asia. Even the EU I think the EU went through several decades now of internal consolidation, expansion, and you see now, I think, and this is something quite normal, I think, among democracies. You focus on a certain issue, and then there will be a time in which you sort of enlarge your horizon again, and I think that's happening now. I mentioned the European Union, for example, now coming out at its toughest moment with the EU global strategy and a maritime strategy, for example, and trying to enlarge its security horizons and establish more of a security and political presence beyond its borders. So I think that's bound to happen, and it's going to create a very interesting debate among a variety of actors now on the geopolitics or the return of geopolitics in many ways. I think we've been pampered in many ways by the post-Cold War era, and in many ways there's several powers now who are facing a very different reality and engaging with it. And I think, there's two options to engage with this new reality and the return of geopolitics. One is saying business as usual. Let's engage the Chinese on economics and business, and let's not think about strategic, political, geopolitical implications, because that's all the language of the past. So it's trade as usual, ignore the challenges. And I think the alternative, and I think that's the more promising alternative, is to engage these disruptions. These are tough times. Take tough decisions which require a very open debate about the political system we live in Europe, in India, in Australia, in Japan. Open, plural systems. The costs we are willing to take on to engage economically and face populist upsurges which are driven by wealth issues and distribution. So there's a pressure, of course, to look at expediency, engage China, engage any power, accept foreign funding, investments, trade relations as an important asset. But I think it's also a very important political discussion we must have within our countries and our polities and among like-minded partners. How do we cooperate in facing these challenges? Let me give you just one example to finish with this. We can speak about democracy in geostrategic terms. We can speak about democracy as elections in parliament. Look at the issue of data governance and data security. One of the most pressing issues of disruptive technology today. It goes to the heart of what Europe has taught us in a spirit of enlightenment, the contract between the individual, the citizen, and the state. How do I give up some securities and liberties for the state to protect me? Now, the disruptive technology of data governance and security now is bringing this issue up in a very salient way. And we have different models. There's an American model of data governance, which is very different from the European one, which is actually trend-setting, as we've seen in the last few months. There's a Chinese model, and we know what that Chinese model is. It puts the emphasis on the state and curtails those liberties. And I think it's going to be a very interesting way to see how India, Australia, Japan, and the various democratic polities come together or not, or are willing to come together to deal with these pressing challenges. Thank you.
Okay, Constantino, thank you very much. Before we move to the Q&A, perhaps something that connects all of the contributions that we have here is what you mentioned here is the activation of the plans B of other countries. And it's more of a rhetorical question that I will pose now, but I'm thinking that perhaps the instability that the Trump administration has brought to the international scene, these activations are even let's say a force multiplier of this instability, because there are going to be, and as we see, let's say strategic realignments, more strategic thinking, which may cause further instability, right? So this is just my question that we can return to if we have time after or during the Q&A. So please, anyone who has a question, please raise your hand and introduce yourself. Do I see anybody? No one? Okay, so maybe could we go to my question, right? Is this something that will disrupt the system even more as countries think of a backdoor, of a plan B? Because Europe is talking about PESCO, all of these, taking care of our security is again amplified by Donald Trump. And it's just not just Europe, it's Australia, as we have heard. Japan is also somehow thinking about these issues. India also. So where can this lead us?
for Australia. I think we should re-stress, at least for Australia, this Plan B is really a shift back to a long-term multilateral agenda anyway. In fact, there's been a lot of what's called presumptive engagement. Australia had massive cooperation with most Southeast Asian states, wanted to get security agreements in the Indian Ocean, pressed forward for this even ahead of Indian policy early on, a bit perhaps pushy in those policies, helped create the ASEAN Regional Forum, a whole range of issues where there was a multilateral agenda supported perhaps more by Labour governments. So if you were actually building Plan B, it would simply be investing and funding those to create another tier of policy activation that would in theory work with the US as well, of course. It might set limits on unilateral policies, but I don't think it would create disorder. I personally think this would actually possibly provide new conduits for cooperation, particularly if you can bring the main players such as India to engage this policy, Japan as well, ASEAN as a whole, South Korea certainly as a very interesting sort of middle power trying its own new phase of foreign policy activation globally. But this does not provide the kind of security or guarantees of the existing alliance frameworks. If you had then a drop of those frameworks, that could create the instability perhaps you were talking about.
I would say that there are two near-peer competitors. We've talked a lot about China, given the composition of the panel, that's logical and relevant. The other country we've not spoken about a lot yet today, and that's Russia. I would maintain there is only one nation, whether it is indispensable or not can be debated, that can handle two near-peer competitors, and that is still the United States. So while Plan Bs are welcome, and certainly creative thinking among our allies on how to address not only security but economic challenges from both of these two near-peer competitors are going to be important and welcome, I think there's still a great role for the one country that is able to work on two fronts at the same time.
I think in terms of thinking about Plan B, still there needs to be some sort of distinction between economic affairs and security and defense affairs. In terms of economy, yes, it's easier to think about Plan B because there are so many stakeholders who are capable of contributing to the maintenance and advancement of liberal international order, multilateral free trade system. But when it comes to security and defense, there are certain limits, inherent limits for smaller countries to do. So this economy and security distinction is one thing, and also still I believe that it's too early to talk about anti-Trump coalition. So some Europeans have been talking about that, and including, and actually several weeks ago, the German foreign minister, Mr. Heiko Maas, visited Tokyo, and he gave a lecture in Tokyo, and in which he proposed a sort of anti-Trump coalition, the coalition of multilateralists. So but from Tokyo's point of view, I think it's still too early to think about that openly, because we are still trying to keep the Americans involved in those discussions. Because the biggest reason for that is that, yes, now we talk a lot about divergence of interest and divergence of values between the US on one hand and the US allies on the other, but still, compared to Russians or Chinese and other countries, we share a lot still. So that still constitutes a very basic foundation on which we can cooperate.
Thanks, Jan. To press this issue, I think there's two things. One is the divergence or difference between security and economics. I understand there is a difference, of course. There are multilateral organizations, regional organizations put the emphasis on technical issues, economic issues, trade, investment. There are other institutions which are classic security alliances. But I find it a very artificial division. And I think China is actually testing that division as we live in an increasingly interdependent world. What China's done, and that's the main lesson, it's entangled itself economically over the last 40 years, 30, 40 years, in particular the last 10 years, with East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean region, now with Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in Central Asia and Europe, and then leverage that and transform that into political and security capital. And all powers have done this in history. In a lesser degree, longer time horizons, the history of security alliances is driven by economic interactions. So it's extremely tempting to say, again, that's why I use the no free lunches metaphor, to say, let's do economics. The EU, you hear this in Brussels these days a lot. Let's do business with the Chinese, and let's do security, politics, culture with all other like-minded partners. That's not feasible, that's not sustainable. Asia is the best example of this. And I think we're seeing an interesting emerging debate across Europe since last year of the implications of doing business with illiberal states, China, but also Russia and other countries. And I mention this because there's three options. You can do nothing about it. And this comes to the point of institutions. What do we do with the existing institutions, the existing order? We can do nothing, ignore, and there's many people who are doing this. Many states who are using that, small states in particular, using that route. A second one is to defend the institutions, which I think you were mentioning in some ways. There are concrete institutions which we have to defend, protect. But I find the third way much more productive, which is develop new institutions or shape and reform the existing institutions. And this leads me to the point of the United States, which plays a cardinal role, no doubt, in the existing institutions. But when I say plans B, it means that the US will play a less significant role and must play a significant role, and actually is already playing a less significant role than 20 years ago. And due credit goes to the United States for creating these institutions and investing in them during the Cold War in very dire circumstances. But it's time for other powers, I think, who've graduated from their small state politics and mentality into a larger club of great geostrategic thinking, take the initiative in their own hand with the US together in the same room and say, what do we do? How do we protect by shaping and reforming these various institutions? So I give the example of technology as an example, which is crucial, right? What system do we want to have 20, 30 years from now in terms of regulating, sharing data of private citizens across borders? It's going to be an imperative that private sector pressures to do this. How do states and civil societies deal with this, right? Are we going to have a state-to-state relationship and discussion about this at the United Nations? Or are we going to have a multi-stakeholder, broader approach to dealing with this issue and crafting new rules, regulations, regimes, institutions, organizations, multilateralism, whatever you want to call it, this language we become used to. So I think that's going to be the main challenge. And I think we should not be under the illusion that, at least, you know, I think the advantage of a liberal order is that you always keep a door open to those who want to join. So there should be a door open for China and Russia to rejoin, join, whatever you want to call it. But we should be no illusion that that is a given, that they will cross that door. The democracies have to defend themselves too. And I think that door must be kept open, but hope is not a policy. And I think the sooner that discussion happens, the better, because you'll be stronger in developing the required governance systems to deliver public goods in an open society. Okay,
thank you. We are out of time, but if there's one very short last question, we can take that. If not, please join me in a round of applause for our distinguished speakers, and we will meet here in about a quarter of an hour after we break for coffee for the next panel. Thank you.